Good morning. This is Josh Scherrer. I am here again to answer your questions about my novel 2020. Today we are going to look at questions that deal with the chapter August. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Giselle asked, what made Tony crash? Was he going too fast or was it the roamers? So, this week there are a lot of questions about Tony and a lot about the boy that's in this chapter. Um, so I might answer a couple of these more than once, but that's okay. So Tony, if you remember at the beginning of the chapter, kind of a little bit halfway through, he is introduced to the reader, and he is going too fast, I think because he explains that a roamer fell onto the roof of his car. And so, in a panic, and he might have been a little bit intoxicated too, once we get a little bit more of a background story about Tony, he is going to accidentally accelerate instead of brake, and that is going to cause him to crash. Because I don't remember exactly how it is described in the book, but the road that I based the story off of, I think it's Wyandotte in the book. The real road, the real life road that runs in front of my own parents' house, it's a straight shot, and then it actually curves at almost a 90-degree angle before going up a hill and curving again in the opposite direction. So anyone that is speeding on that straightaway, if you don't know the road curves, you will go off into the ditch. And so that's really what Tony does in the book. Good question, Giselle. Iana asks, how did the little boy even get in the abandoned house if the patrolling system is tight? So this is one of the first questions about the boy that we find quite a bit here in our selection of questions for today. And this is a good question. If they are continually circulating around the perimeter, how did a roamer get in? And so the simple answer to that is, Marlon and his dad, and then later Tony, even though they're always on a patrol, they can't be in every place at once. And so, especially since the boy is small, it only takes a few seconds to go from one side of the perimeter to the other side, to the inside, and get into the house. And so that's what happens with the boy. Kayla asked, do you think Tony is grateful to have found them, meaning Marlon and his dad? And I think probably, if I had to guess, we don't know a whole lot about Tony at this point. And, he's kind of a secondary character in the book. But I think, knowing what's going on in the story and in the world of the book, Tony is like anybody else. And once you find someone that isn't infected and is a normal human, they are going to be grateful. And I think Tony's probably the same. He's probably grateful that he actually found some civilization, if you will. Chelsea asked, what would you do to get everything back to normal? That is a very loaded question. I don't really know the answer to that. If we're talking about what would Marlon do to get everything back to normal, I think you just have to keep going with that day-to-day routine, and that's kind of what he does with his father. His dad, of course, is still grieving the loss of his mother, his dad's wife, and so, just sticking to a routine. And I know personally, in my actual life, in the life of my family right now, we are like everybody else here in the United States. We are in the middle of the pandemic. And so we stick to a routine. Every day we do kind of the same thing, even though we can do schoolwork anytime we really want to, especially, my kids. We do Monday through Friday schoolwork. Every morning they get online and they check their assignments and they do some work. And then we try and keep the weekend as the weekend. And we don't do any schoolwork, and we have just free time and do things as a family. And try and stick to that routine that we would just as if the pandemic didn't exist. And I think, for anybody in the book, sticking to that routine even as simple as getting up at the same time every day, going to bed about the same time every day. That routine is comforting, but it also helps maintain their sanity. And in a way, it helps get back to normal. That was a very good question. Alessandra asked, why hasn't that dad spoke before? If you remember in the previous chapter, the mother dies, and it's just a way to show that the father's grieving. And so when he finally speaks, it's kind of symbolic that his period of grief is maybe not over, but it's definitely changing. Nira asks, when you become infected, do you have more non-human abilities than the average human? And I asked because Marlon said the boy jumped off the refrigerator onto the counter, and if that was me, I would have fell. And so, yes, that is true. I am definitely not the most agile person, so I could not jump from a refrigerator to a countertop, no matter what age I was. And I can tell you that my children are not very athletic and agile either. So if they tried to do that, even though the refrigerator and the counter are right next to each other, they would probably fall and break an arm or a leg or something. So this is an example of some foreshadowing. We'll see later on what happens to people infected as roamers and kind of how their physiological state changes, not just their mental state, but their body as well. And so that kind of becomes a piece of the book later on. So in a way, it's a little bit of foreshadowing that the boy is able to be so agile, even though he is clearly infected and not, a normal human. Good question. Carissa asked, were you scared or just confused when your father woke you up and told you to get your rifle? So you're talking about when Marlon gets woken up because they are going to go discover Tony. I think it's probably a little bit of both, a little bit of confusion and maybe a little bit of fright because, you don't usually get up unless it's your turn to patrol or if something major is happening. And so for his father to wake him up like that, it's going to kind of rouse you from your state of sleep for once. You're going to be kind of out of sorts. You're going to be disoriented. But then also, it's like, what in the world is happening that I have to get up? Okay. And so the fact that they find Tony and, don't find a huge horde of roamers or something is probably in the end a little bit more comforting for Marlon. Let's see. Betsy asked, my question for the author is, will he tell his father about the little kid that he killed in the kitchen? We get a similar question a little bit down the line here. I don't want to give too much away, but the actions that Marlon takes throughout the book, and sometimes an action can also be an inaction. So by not saying something about the little boy, that could have consequences down the line. So I don't want to give too much away, but let's just leave it at that. Brandon asked, why have they been able to expand the perimeter during this downfall? So, Brandon, really, it was kind of just a plot device to expand the perimeter. I tried to logically think as the author, if I was in a similar situation and I didn't have really anything else to do, what would be my number one priority? And if my number one priority, as Marlon has kind of established in the book, is his safety, the way you increase your safety is to increase the distance between yourself and whatever threat there is out there somewhere. And so for Marlon and for, by extension, his dad, that translates into increasing the perimeter. Now, how they did that, he kind of Marlon mentions a couple times that they, take materials from neighboring farms. When they go into town, they get supplies. So we assume some of those supplies might be for fencing or for whatever. A perimeter really is just an area around something. And so it's not like it's Fort Knox or a huge fortress. It could just be that they've strung up some chicken wire or something, some very thin wire to try and keep the roamers out. We don't really know because he doesn't really talk about it that much. And as the author, I didn't put that much detail into it. But if you don't have anything else to do and you put all your attention into it, that's what gives them the ability to increase the size of the perimeter? Interesting question. Okay, so Gabrielle asked, why was the little boy holding a cookie? Could it be that the roamers are still human inside? Very good insight. Saying, could it be that they are a little bit human? The answer is yes, they are still a little bit human. In fact, at some point in the book, and I don't remember exactly where off the top of my head, but Marlin kind of has this monologue, this inner dialogue, and then he mentions it to his dad also, that they, the roamers, are not zombies, okay? And as the author, I made this distinction because I thought it was important for Marlin's character to note that unlike all the zombie movies that we've probably heard of or we might have seen or, whatever, the concept of a zombie in American culture is this creature that's not alive. It's not necessarily dead either, but, it's mindless. There's no consequence to killing it. If you kill a zombie, it's not like you're killing anything that has a chance of a normal life, right? And so by saying that these roamers are really just people infected with TBR, they're just infected humans. They're still human. They just have manifested this horrible disease. The boy and the cookie serve as a reminder that all these people or roamers or whatever you want to say that Marlin has come into contact with, they are still, their very, very inner core are still human, Could the boy have chased down a rabbit and eaten it or something? Probably, I could have put that in there as the author, but something as innocent as stealing a cookie out of a cookie jar, something that, a lot of little kids do. I know my kids have stolen cookies out of cookie jars when they were little. To put that in there shows that there is still some humanity in the roamers, and the consequence that Marlin feels of killing the boy makes it even more emotionally stressful for Marlin because, the boy wasn't trying to attack him or anything like that. The boy was just trying to get a cookie. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Cherokee asked, almost the same question. The little boy was holding a cookie. So if the little boy was still human, would that mean he killed a harmless little kid? And the answer is yes. He did, but at the same time, he did not. And, the boy could have easily jumped on Marlin and bit his neck. The boy could have just as easily tried to claw Marlin apart. He didn't, though. And so as the reader, you are passing judgment on Marlin. And I intended as the author for you to do that. Did Marlin do the right thing? Did he do the wrong thing by killing the boy? Or is there no right or wrong because it's such a messed up situation that whatever Marlin does, it's pretty hopeless. If Marlin doesn't do anything and then the boy attacks Marlin, Marlin dies. If Marlin does kill the boy and the boy wasn't trying to attack Marlin, then Marlin's killed a boy. So there's no good answer. And I did that by design as the author. Okay, Johanna asked, how did the little kid get into the house if they were patrolling? So again, I've mentioned this before. Patrols aren't perfect. Things get past you all the time. That's just kind of how it is. Tabitha asked, who was the little boy that Marlin shot? Did Tony have any other family? So a two-part question. We don't know who the little boy was. Probably some little boy that at one point in time lived in Boonville. And we don't really know. We don't really get any more detail about the little boy. But that's kind of just a little boy. He had a family at some point. And then Tony, I think Tony mentions he had a family maybe. But we don't really know his extended family. We don't know, where Tony grew up. We don't really know much backstory about Tony. And, I did that for a couple reasons as the author. One, was because I didn't really want to put a whole lot of effort into Tony because he's a secondary character. We don't really get into the mind of Tony. But then the other reason is Tony is kind of a mysterious character. We don't really know if we can trust Tony or not. Tony is this extra element in the story. He's this new person that we introduce. And so there's this lack of trust that we have as readers, but also a lack of trust that Marlon has and his father has of Tony. We think Tony's probably going to be all right. We know that he wants to go on patrol. He proves it by going out unarmed or whatever. But we just don't quite know who Tony is. Okay, Jair asked, why did you make the story about zombies? Fair enough question. So I think I mentioned at the very beginning, it might have been in my introduction video at the very beginning or one of the early question and answer sessions. So I tried not to make just another zombie book. There are really good zombie books. I'll give a plug for World War Z. Might not be appropriate for middle school children. It's been a while since I looked at the book. But there are good zombie novels out there, okay? But they serve a specific purpose. A zombie novel is designed to show that humans fight against hopeless odds. It's kind of what a zombie novel is all about. Realistically, the survivors, they don't have any chance of surviving, right? Almost every zombie movie, you have one or two survivors at the end, and everybody else has been eaten by this point, by the end of the movie or by the end of the book or whatever. So I didn't want to create just another zombie novel, but at the same time, there is nothing as scary and as daunting as your fellow human beings, right? I mean, the only thing that is more frightening than your fellow humans is yourself, right? Because you have the capability of doing a lot of things that you might not be happy with once you reflect on it. So I knew I wanted to create a story about Marlon and his inner conflict, but I also needed some sort of external conflict for him to face as well. And so at the time, like I mentioned at some point, there was an actual news story about people that were attacking each other. They were under the influence of drugs, I think, bath salts maybe. And so I had heard those stories, like actual news stories. And then there was actually a news report out of Africa about a sleeping sickness, which is caused by a TBR parasite. I would try and pronounce the actual scientific name. I put it in the book, but pronouncing it, not so much. But I combined that sleeping sickness, the real disease that is found in Africa, with the behavior of people under bath salts and created this pandemic in the book. So yes, they are infected with the TBR virus, or it's not even really a virus, it's a parasite. They are infected with this protozoa, this parasite, and it does alter them, and it does make them seem less human, but they are still human. Like, they're not the living dead, as you sometimes hear zombies being called. If you get eaten, you don't come back as a roamer, right? If you get eaten, you're dead. But if you get infected, then you're still alive, but your life has been drastically altered by the disease. So that's kind of why I made the book the way I did. Again, two reasons. I wanted to focus on the internal conflict of Marlon first. And then second, I needed something for him to confront that was very difficult for any person to confront because of the moral choices you have to make. So I hope that answered your question. That was a pretty good question. It's a very detailed and involved question, as simple as it is. All right. Benjamin asked, my question is, if they see another healthy human being in trouble like Tony, would they try to help him and befriend him? So yes, they would. And I think that's why, if you remember the IGA scene, I think that's why it was so difficult for them at the IGA, because they wanted to just get help or give help to this guy, and instead he does not want to be friendly. And so I think given the opportunity, they would be friendly. They would befriend as many people as they could. But you never know how humans are going to react when faced with a serious situation, right? Tony just so happens for lack of better words, he's probably still drunk whenever he wrecks his car. And he sleeps it off in their garage. And once he comes around, fortunately for Marlon and his dad, Tony's a halfway decent guy, right? But now, if Marlon was some crazy homicidal maniac, and when he wakes up in the garage, he tries to murder Marlon and his dad, we could have easily seen that in the book, because you can't really trust anybody, and that's kind of the point. All right, so sorry, I'm trying not to get off here. Okay. So David asked, why did you want the chapter to take place in acres of land? So David, the easiest way to explain this is an author writes about what they are familiar with. At least that's my advice to anybody that is a new author. Could I write about ballerinas? Sure. Could I write about scuba diving? Sure. But the amount of research involved to make it a realistic story would be a huge burden on me because I'm not familiar with either of those topics. Ballerina dancing or scuba diving. Never been scuba diving, and I certainly have never danced in ballet. So if you are a new author or if you're an author that is leaning towards something that you want to be realistic, you go off of what you know. And so I grew up on 10 acres of land, which isn't a whole lot in my area, in my region. People have hundreds of acres of land if they're farmers. But the 10 acres was a lot of land for me, because I originally grew up in a trailer park, actually. And so to move out to 10 acres was like wide open spaces. So I wanted to base the story on what I knew from my childhood. And so that's kind of why I focused the book so much in the early part on Boonville and on that land, because I knew the land. I based a lot of the story on the land that I was from. And then even like scenes in Boonville and things are all based on my childhood. Excellent question. Okay, so Jada asked, if roamers can turn people into roamers, how did it all start? Was it like a failed science experiment and it got out of hand? So Jada, you are very perceptive. I don't want to give too much away because the book really reveals a lot of this stuff. But yes, there has to be some sort of origin. It can transmit from human to human, but it didn't always transmit from human to human. Kind of like we still don't know at the time of this video, we don't really know where COVID-19 came from. The argument is, did it come from a laboratory? Did it come from a bat? Did it just mutate between humans? We don't really know, but it had to have some sort of origin. The pandemic that we are currently in as Americans, it had to originate somewhere, and where that is, we're not for sure, but we'll find out eventually, just like Marlon will find out a little bit more about his own pandemic. Hannah asks, why did he get taken from his family in the first place? Are you referring to Tony here? And if you're referring to Tony, I'm not really for sure what his circumstance was. Even as the author, I kind of left a little bit of it as a mystery to myself, which sounds weird because I'm the guy that created the whole thing. But I wanted him to be a mystery. And if you're referring to the little boy, we just don't know. The little boy is a roamer, and the definition of a roamer is they roam about. So did he have a larger family somewhere? Was he part of a, quote unquote pack? We don't know. As the reader, we don't know. Okay, so Jory asks, how is it that this is the first time we have seen a little boy as a roamer? Fair enough question. Uh, really the best answer is it's where he fit into the story. We assume that maybe, if you wanted to hypothesize about it, maybe the adult roamers are the ones that typically find the food. And, if they're still somewhat human, maybe we don't really see this roamer behavior very much. We just see the interactions and Marlin usually shoots them. But maybe they actually harvest food, they collect food, and they bring it back to their, whatever their family is, what you could call a family. And so maybe they provide food for their younger roamers. We don't know. It just happens that as the author, this is where the boy fit in the story. And so this is why this is the first time we've seen him. But that is a very good question as to why we've only seen a certain type of roamer up until this point. Okay, so Eric asked, why did Tony get drunk while trying to escape? All right, so I'm trying to think of a good way to say this. Tony is scared, okay? And not that this is a good choice and not that you should ever do this, okay? Do not get drunk. Do not really drink at all because drinking is going to impair your judgment. But for Tony, he either had the option of impairing his judgment or basically surrendering himself to death. Because at this point, and Tony kind of mentions this, the roamers are closing in on him. He doesn't know what to do. All he's got is alcohol. And so he chooses, not that it's the right choice, but he chooses to drink. And then when he chooses to drink, when he gets intoxicated, his inhibitions lower, which is an effect of alcohol. And then he chooses, because of his impaired state and his probably poor judgment, to get into a vehicle and then drive off. And I think he's from Hatfield, if I remember correctly, is where I made him from in the book. Hatfield is not very far from Boonville. Realistically, if he was that impaired, if he was that drunk, he probably would not have made it to Boonville or even to the south side of Boonville, which is where the Hartman farm is. But again, it's a little writer's liberty here in how he gets from point A to point B. But yeah, the short answer is he got drunk because he didn't really have any other option in his mind, and he wanted to face his reality by escaping reality, if that makes sense. All right, Alicia asked, why did the boy try to jump out the window when he heard someone coming and not try to hide somewhere? Okay. So I've mentioned this term before. You have a fight or flight response. So your choice is either to fight or to run away. And we really have a third response. Fight or flight just alliterates, so it sounds better. And that is to take shelter somewhere. Now, for the boy, if he is kind of animalistic, he is probably not a predator. If you're either a predator or prey, because he's scavenging for cookies and not out hunting, like I mentioned a minute ago, a rabbit or something, like you would think a wild, savage beast would. He's looking for a cookie. He probably has this flight response as opposed to this shelter-in-place response. Because if you seek shelter, there's a chance whatever's hunting you can find you. But if you run away, if you know you're faster, then you'll escape the danger. And so really that's just why the boy tried to get away. He, in his twisted mind, this is me speaking as the author, putting the thoughts into the boy, he just took the option to try and flee. Unfortunately for him, and to a certain extent, unfortunately for Marlin, was able to shoot him and kill him. All right, good question. So the next question is, Jayla, the title of this book is clear, but why didn't you include more than one person knowing, everyone going through something? Okay, so I've talked about this a little bit before, whenever I was asked why I wrote the book the way I did. And the answer to the question is, when you are an author, you can write from a few different perspectives, points of view. And so if I was an omnipresent author, then I would be able to go into any character's thoughts and pull out whatever thoughts that they had and show them to the reader. Okay? If I was a limited omnipresent author, I could pick from a few characters. Okay? Especially if I was still third-person author. If you are a first-person author, if you are someone that writes from the first-person point of view, it limits what you see as the reader to what that person sees. And because I wanted to deal mostly with Marlin's inner turmoil, I didn't want to just write about Marlin's thoughts. I wanted Marlin to write about his thoughts in his own words, which is why I chose the journal. It's also a fairly easy way, because this was the very first book that I ever wrote, full book anyway. I wrote, different short stories and things, but never published them. But this was the first full book that I wrote. And if this was any other book, I could probably write it from a different perspective. But as a new author and someone that was kind of an amateur at what I was doing, I'm not professionally trained as an author. I didn't have an English major in college or anything like that. But it was easy for me to kind of pretend for a moment that I was Marlin, and I could write as if I was Marlin. And I did that through writing those journal entries. And so that's why I chose to only have the perspective of Marlin, and why I specifically chose that perspective of a first person, because it was easier to do, quite honestly. But then also, as the reader, you can only judge Marlin based on his own actions, right? So what we see, even though he describes other things that are going on, they are always from the point of view of Marlin. So could it be that Marlin sometimes fibs a little bit, maybe stretches the truth, maybe changes what happens? We don't know. I'm not saying that he does, but his point of view is going to be limited to what he believes. Okay. Devin asked, in this chapter we see the first child. And so is there an age where they can turn infected, or do they die if they are too weak in the immune system to handle it? That is a very good question. It's something that I never really addressed as an author. So as the reader, you can come up with that decision on your own. I think it would be very logical that if it's an infection like any other infection, whether it be a virus or a bacteria or a protozoa or fungus or whatever, if your body can't fight that infection, you die. And so even though it's not really said, roamers in a way are probably fighting the infection. They're still moving, they're still going, they're still in that survival mode, which is why they're all the time hunting, and they're all the time violent, because they're trying to survive. And so even though it doesn't seem like it, their body's probably trying to fight off the TBR protozoa. But, if you are weak or elderly, or if you are very young and, your immune system can't handle it, maybe you do die. Like I said, I never really addressed it as an author, but that is something that you would want to think about as a reader. So that's an excellent point that you made. Okay, so Carla asked, was the little kid not infected or not affected? Yes, the little kid was infected. So we do know that he can be infected, that little children can be infected. How often they are, as I just mentioned in Devin's question, we don't know. It's something that we don't really see a whole lot in the book. All right. Marcella asked, if he is sick of patrols, why doesn't he just leave and go with his children and kids? So yes, Marlon kind of complains a lot about being tired of the patrols and wishing that he could go find his children. Marlon doesn't for a couple of different reasons. One is, as the reader, we have to be very cautious about his mental state. Is he of sound mind, which means, is he making the right decisions? And we could argue probably by this point in August that maybe he's not making the right decisions all the time. And then the other point, and Marlon himself mentions this, is that he is afraid that if he did something else, then his father would not survive. And so his immediate threat to his family is the well-being of his father. He believes his brother is with his children at this point. So he is probably still worried about his children, but knows that his brother is stronger than his father. His father's older, father's weaker. And his father, of course, mentally now is devastated because of his mom's death, Marlon's mother's death. So Marlon makes the decision to stay with his father, even though he is sick of patrols. All right. So Cesar asked, and this was kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, why couldn't the dad speak? Again, the dad was grieving, and it just so happens that by the end of the chapter, his dad has kind of moved on from that stage. And, people do strange things when they grieve. Some people turn to their faith. Some people turn, unfortunately, to alcohol or other drugs. Some people start writing. Some people, just bury it down deep and try and go on like normal. Some people visibly weep for days, and some people just become stone-faced. They just stop talking, stop communicating. And so, Marlon's father, his grief took the form of just nothingness. He was emotionally very vacant, on the outside at least, as he processed the death of his wife. All right, Brianna asked, even if Tony was not a roamer, why did they let him in the house? Because what if he was a roamer? Tony would have gotten them infected. So there was that risk, and Marlon kind of mentions this briefly whenever they stick him in the garage, and then they kind of, monitor him. I think he even says that his dad, kind of stood watch over Tony that first night. Marlon has a little bit of experience seeing how quickly people change at the very beginning of the book. If you remember Mr. Harrison, he kind of changed over the course of a day or two. And so Marlon probably in his mind thinks, okay, if Tony was infected, he would start showing signs sooner than later. And Tony, by his own right, tried to prove that he was not a roamer, that he was worthy of, being included with Marlon and his dad by going out on patrol by himself. And so whenever he did that and showed no signs of being infected, Marlon and his dad just kind of accepted the fact that he probably was not infected with TBR. All right. Fabiola asked, why don't you like to try to convince your dad to leave the house with you and tell him everything will be okay if you all stay together and protect each other, or something logical like that? And maybe try to make some weapons, maybe out of wood, or anything that can be useful and sharp. All right. So I think Marlon, if he could, would convince his dad to leave. But at the same time, Marlon, and I've kind of hinted at this a couple times, Marlon is probably not in the best emotional state either, because not only did his mother die, which he is also grieving along with his dad, but his wife is also dead, according to his father, right? Because his dad found out that she had apparently died when she was seeking refuge in Henderson. So Marlon probably could have convinced his dad, but then again, if his dad was as stubborn as Marlon, he probably wouldn't budge. And, as I've said, Marlon believes right now the biggest challenge is protecting his father, because, again, his children are apparently being protected by his brother. And so I think he has this trust of his brother that his children will be okay. All right. Cecilia asks, is Tony going to turn his back on them one day? So that is a very excellent question. What will happen to Tony? Anytime you have a new character introduced, there is this bit of mystery about them. Will he stick with them? Will he go his separate way? Will he betray them? They have all this stuff collected. And Tony even goes into town one day, and Marlin goes with him because he's afraid Tony might try and escape, but apparently he doesn't. So we don't really know what's going to happen with Tony, at least not yet, but you will soon. All right. Michelle asked, why did the little boy stay up on the fridge the whole time? Again, probably that fight or flight. The boy hesitates for a little bit, thinks he can escape, takes his opportunity to escape, but he's a little bit slow. Marlin turns, shoots him. Boy dies. Marlin, of course, suffers the emotional consequence to the point that he doesn't even mention it, which can lead to bigger issues down the road. Okay, Maria asked, I think it was nice that you and your dad helped the guy, but why would you let him stay in your house if he was infected? Or maybe he was infected. So again, they don't know 100% if Tony's infected or not. But after keeping him in the garage there for a little bit, they feel fairly confident that Tony is probably not infected. And it's a calculated risk, which means that there's always a risk, but chances are he is okay. And he seems to be anyway for the rest of the chapter. All right, Javon Gray asked, so does the virus only affect humans or does it affect animals too? That is a good question. As the author, I never really breached the subject much of how animals were affected. Some diseases can be transmitted from humans to animals and vice versa, from animals to humans. Some are strictly animal to animal and some are strictly human to human. We don't really know, as the reader of the book, is it possible that yes, animals are infected? Of course. However, we don't hear of a lot of animal attacks. So either the roamers are the top predators and they're just killing off the animals and eating them, or the animals have all run away. We don't really know for sure what's going on. So I don't really have an answer, I guess, other than it is possible that the animals are infected, but we don't have enough information to know that. All right. A couple more questions here. Alejandra asked, why didn't he mention the kid to Tony? Was he afraid or did he not want to? The answer to that is he felt shame. Okay, he doesn't come out and say this, but Marlin is ashamed of what he has done, and he's so disturbed by what he has done. He's killed a child, right? Someone younger than his own children, killed that kid. And I based that emotional response that Marlin had, learning about history and learning about the effects that soldiers felt in war whenever they had to shoot a child. Because I'll give you an example. During World War II, the Nazi youth, which were children, 12 years old, younger, a few of those children actually took up arms. They actually took up weapons against American soldiers and would shoot at American soldiers. And so, of course, if you're defending yourself, you're going to have to shoot those children, okay? It's one thing to shoot against a trained soldier. It's still very horrible, I would imagine. Like I said, thankfully, I have never been in that situation. But I could imagine that it would be psychologically terrible. Then just imagine, 1,000 times fold how much more terrible it would be to kill someone that is just acting because they're adults who are supposed to take care of them, train them to do that, right? And so Marlon feels that same emotional response of shame and just disgust at taking the life of a child. So that's kind of why he doesn't tell Tony in the story. And then finally, the last question is from Alexander, who asked, what if there are more roamers that they don't know about when they're out looking for them? And so this issue will actually come up later because, Marlon is going to continue to interact and come into contact with the roamers. And, it's not foolproof, their plan. They think they have a plan of how to keep the roamers at bay, but it doesn't take much to get overpowered by a pack of roamers or to not know that they're coming, in from a different direction when you're dealing with something facing the opposite direction. A lot of things can go wrong, and we will see very quickly in the chapters September, October, November, December, and then the end January. Things are going to start happening very rapidly for Marlon. And so with that is the end of the questions for August. Like I said, you are going to start getting into the fast-paced part of the book. A lot of things are going to happen, so you'll probably have quite a few questions about it. I look forward to hearing your questions, and I will do my best to answer those. You've come up with some really challenging questions, questions that as the author, I have never really thought of. I mean, then even as the reader, like when I go back and read it, I don't always think of the questions that you come up with. So congratulations to you all for being very active readers and being very thoughtful readers. I hope you continue to enjoy the book, and I will talk to you next time. Until then, take care.